Okay, thank you very much everybody for coming along at 8:30 in the morning. I was going to point out that it's actually 7:30 in the morning in Brisbane at this point, so this is way before my normal getting up time. But I mean, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking we do have international people here who are probably presenting in the middle of the night, so I probably can't complain too much. I'd like to thank Adam from the AIC and the AIC for inviting me along to talk to you about this work. It's always a pleasure to be able to get out and share some of the work that we've been doing at Griffith University. The particular project that I'm going to talk about, or the particular thing I'm going to talk about today, is a project that was funded by the Australian Research Council in 2006, everyone can hear me now, 2006, 2007, and that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years, so we really have only finished this in the last 6 months or so. And I would like to also talk about the fact that along with being funded by the Australian Research Council, there are a couple of other chief investigators on this project apart from myself, Susan Dennison and Christine Smith. There was also additional funding provided by Department of Communities, Legal Aid Queensland and the Office of Economic and Statistical Research in Queensland. And I also especially want to acknowledge the people that really did all the work for this project, which wasn't me, I just stand up here and take the credit. The people, April Kronosky, Carleen Thompson and Troy Allard, who did all our costing and sitting here in the audience with us today. But before I start, I'd like to talk a bit about why I decided to do this project, to put a bit of context around why I decided to do the project. The area of criminology that I'm interested in, one of the many areas that I'm actually interested in, is life course criminology and criminal careers. And this is an area of criminology that understands how people initiate, participate and desist in offending, and also tries to look at what sort of risk factors there are for offending and what sort of protective factors. So how can we move people out of offending careers, or what makes or what drives people into offending careers. So I'm really interested in this area and I've been working in it for a number of years, and one of the things you realise when you work in this area that not all offenders are the same. You know, this seems fairly self-obvious probably to everybody in this room, but you know, when people talk about offenders, you seem to think that they're some sort of homogeneous group, but in actual fact they're not. They're extraordinarily heterogeneous. Yeah, I've got 2 words I can't get out now. And one of the techniques that we use, a statistical technique for trying to understand different groups of offenders, is something called trajectory analysis. And we've been doing trajectory analyses on data in Australia for a number of years. And it shows that what trajectory analysis does was enable us to look at different groups of offenders. And so we find these things, and I'm sure all of you have heard about them, as sort of adolescent onset offenders, serious persistent offenders, those sort of offending groups come out of trajectory analysis. What we know when we understand that we've got very different types of offenders is that we understand we also need very different types of crime prevention approaches. So we need approaches that will prevent the initiation of offending. So that's the sort of early intervention, school-based programs that will stop people from actually going on and offend. We also need programs that will, when people start offending, will stop them from continuing to offend. And there are also a range of programs around that reduce offending. So they reduce specific offence. So they tend to be situationally based programs. And I heard a really great program yesterday from a guy called Hector Navarro, I probably can't pronounce that, looking at place-based programs addressing alcohol-related violence. So those sorts of we've got to have multiple approaches to crime prevention, and these approaches have to be targeted to the different types of offences and the different types of offenders. We also need to, and at this time, 4 years ago, I really realised that one of the things that governments were starting to look at was the cost and doing cost-benefit analysis. So we need to understand the cost implications of different type of offending, of different type of offences over time. And this was something that there seemed to be, well, there was actually very little work being done in this particular area. One of the things was, the reasons why I was thinking like this was that many of the early intervention programs that are targeting 4, 5, 6-year-olds won't show impacts on crime prevention for 10 or 15 years. And these sorts of programs, of course, are quite politically unpalatable. But if you can say that in 10 or 15 years, these people are likely to be offending at this rate, and this will prevent them from going on, and this will save this much money, we are likely to be able to provide a political argument for actually introducing early intervention programs. And also many of the evidence-based intervention programs, the evidence-based therapeutic programs, are targeting very small groups of people and are very expensive. So the question it asks is that actually cost effective? Well, you need to know how much an expensive offender is, if that's, and who you're targeting with those programs. So that came to my final question, is what are the lifetime costs to the justice system and society of different offender trajectories? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. That was a very long introduction. So what I'm going to talk about today is the data set, and there are numbers, quite a lot of numbers, and I cut most of them out, I'd like to say. I'm big on numbers. The data set, this is my 83-84 Queensland longitudinal data set. How do we cost individuals' lifetime offending careers? What do the offending trajectories look like, and how much do these trajectories cost? And what are the implications of these findings? So, the data set. This is the data set that we've been working with over a number of years, and this is a longitudinal data set, and it contains linked information on individuals who were born in 1983 or 1984 and have had contact with either the Queensland Child Protection System, the Queensland Youth Court for a finalised appearance, the Queensland Police for a caution. I've got Anne conferencing, Youth Justice conferencing there, but at the time that people who were born in 1983-84 turned 17, remembering that in Queensland, once you turn 17, you're no longer considered to be a juvenile, you're actually in the adult court. Conferencing was in a pilot mode, so we've only got a very small number of conferences in this database. Police cautioning, and they were police-referred conferences. Police cautioning is what mainly is in here. The adult court for a finalised appearances, and we have information in this database from corrections on community-based correctional orders and custodial correction orders. This is administrative data, so we are pulling from administrative data systems. These data have a number of advantages in that they are population-based data, so I can compare them roughly to the population of Queensland, because we've got everybody in Queensland. They are the advantages that we have, and I've written them all down, is it's longitudinal data. Getting longitudinal data is hard work. You know, collecting data over time, if you're doing that as a data collection method, it's quite difficult because you have to go back wave after wave, whereas I've cheated and just pulled it off the databases. It gives us some insight into individuals' different contact with different systems across their life course too. So we've been able to look at the links between child protection and youth justice and adult offending. Also gives us some understanding of recidivism. So if a person is cautioned in the youth justice system, do they reappear, and do they reappear in the adult system? The disadvantages, of course, of having this is that not all offending or child protection systems come to the attention of the official system, so it's not included in there. It doesn't contain all the variables that we would be really interested in. Things like a lot of the protective variables aren't collected by the departments. And we have attrition. People leave the state, people die, and we don't have information about them. And we also have migration into Queensland, and we have quite a lot of migration. So we will have people in Queensland who are offending, who we don't have their youth justice system or their child protection system data. However, given those limitations, it's still an extraordinarily valuable database. The data were finally linked in 2011, and at this stage our cohort was 25 or 26 years old. So when I talk about across the life course, I'm actually talking from 10, which is the age of criminal responsibility, through to 25 or 26 years, 15 years of offending data. Okay, so what does this database look like? We have 54,500 individuals in this database. This is and I'm really only talking about the criminal justice, contact with the criminal justice system. If we look at child protection, we actually have about 61,000, but I'm not looking at those today. These 54,000 individuals are responsible for over 300,000 offences. So these people have committed multiple offences, and these 300,000 offences have resulted in 169,000 finalised events, right? So at any one event, i.e. a caution or a court appearance, there might be multiple offences finalised at that particular event. So that's why we have this sort of levels of it. So these events include police diversion, 20,000, and there are about 400 youth justice conferences in there. Finalised youth court appearances, 15,000. Finalised adult court appearances, by far the majority, 130,000, with the higher courts there as well. So what type of offences? As you might imagine, the majority of these offences are property. We actually have a lot of traffic offences in here. This is the contested traffic offences go to court in Queensland, and also drunk driving and some of the licence offences all go through to court. But for our trajectory analysis, we've actually removed the traffic offences because sometimes they go and sometimes they don't. But that's what the range of offences look like, those 300,000 offences. What are the outcomes? By far the majority of people have a non-supervised order, a fine. We have 6% of not guilty, which I have removed for future analyses because they aren't offenders. But I've actually only removed the offending with a not guilty outcome. So many people will actually have some not guilty as well as guilties in there, so they'll still be in the database. I'm going to quickly, before I get on to the main one, talk about some of the interesting findings that we've had from the 83-84. So just looking at how many Queenslanders offend, what age they are when they first offend, what are the links between youth justice and adult offending, how many offenders are diverted by police, and what percentage of offenders receive a custodial sentence. Now, there's a huge amount of information in here, huge amount of information in our data set. So, you know, I'm trying to pick the highlights out of it. The first one, which is actually one of the most scary numbers that I've ever seen, is that by age 25, 26, 53,000 had at least one offending contact, which represents 41% of all Queenslanders. 41% of all Queenslanders come into contact by the age of 25, 26 for an offending. So they come into a court or a police conference. This, to me, was a remarkable figure, and I thought, oh my God, we've done something wrong. You know, somewhere we've stuffed this up. So I actually went out and asked a number of people that I know how many of them had actually had contact with the system, and I was surprised to find how many people have had contact with the criminal justice system. When you actually ask them directly, and these are people that I know, right? So, you know, university, high socioeconomic, blah, blah, blah. So I'm thinking, okay, that's probably right. And if you look at overseas data, in actual fact, it is quite comparable. The really, really scary thing is that when you actually start looking at it in relation to Indigenous and gender, what we see is 90% of all Indigenous males in Queensland have had contact with the criminal justice system by the age 25, 26. 90% of all. Again, you go, is this right? But I have talked to people in our Queensland court system that were looking at trying to get people, Indigenous men, to work in the communities, and saying that they could hardly find any that didn't have a criminal history. So it is right. So 46% of Indigenous females, 45% of non-Indigenous males, and 13% of non-Indigenous females. First nasty statistic, next one. What age were they when they first offended? Now, 17 here, this is when they turned from the youth court to the adult court. What we see is that the majority of people are initiating when they're in their 17 or 18 years old. Those are the big ages, but we do have, she says we do have 40, she said moving her statistics on, we do have 31% offended first as a juvenile, so before the age of 17. Links between the youth justice system and adult system, 31% here, next slide. Of offenders first offended before the age of 17 years. of those people who offended before the age of 17, 59, almost 60% also went on to offend as an adult, and 69% of offenders offended only as an adult. How many young offenders were diverted by police? Now we're looking at life course diversion, right? So this is whether or not they ever received, as a juvenile, because in Queensland you can only receive a caution in the youth justice system, how many actually ever received it. And we found that 91% of our young offenders had actually been diverted by the time, at least once. 83% of Indigenous offenders and 88% of non-Indigenous offenders. Looks like we've got a disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but whereas information, one, you have to plead guilty before you're eligible for a diversion, and the second thing is you can't divert for serious offences. So we're not sure whether or not this disparity is in relation to a bias by the police or whether or not it's in relation to the different legislative requirements of the different offending profiles. However, what it does show is that it's not an enormous disparity. And the other thing it shows is that we keep on saying we should divert more, but in actual fact the majority of offenders are being diverted, right? So police probably can't divert that much more. We have 97% that had unknown status, and they're actually quite a large group of the offenders are unknown. 38% had missing data. This is because the Queensland Police didn't actually formally have to collect data on Indigenous status until 2003, and these data were all collected prior to that time. So we have a lot of missing data on kids that were only cautioned. If they actually appeared again in the system, we could back propagate, but those that were only cautioned, we have a lot of missing data. We've actually replicated this data with our 1990 data set, which we've been more recently collecting, and we get very similar findings without the same missing data. What percentage of offenders received a custodial sentence? And I'm talking about both detention or prison here. I've added them together. 5% of all our offenders received a custodial sentence. However, over a quarter of Indigenous males received a custodial sentence. Remembering that we've already got 90% of Indigenous males in our data set, this means that by the time that they're 25 or 26, 1 in 4 Indigenous males in Queensland have had a custodial sentence, have gone to prison by the time they're 25. I think these are horrifying statistics. We all know about the overrepresentation, but I don't think we really understand what it means in terms of the life experience of some of these people. 11% of Indigenous females, 5% of non-Indigenous males, 2% of non-Indigenous females. Okay, so back on track with my talk. What I'm going to talk about, how do we cost individuals lifetime offending careers? Now, I'm not an economist. Someone else stood up and introduced themselves as not an economist. I'm not an economist either. And if you ask me any tricky questions, I'm going to throw straight to Troy, who's also not an economist, but he did all the work on this area, and I must acknowledge that. Just to start with, the cost of crimes are very complicated. Really, that's all I'm trying to say with this slide. You don't actually have to read it. The costs are borne by all sectors of our society. The victims, who have a whole range of costs, including, time off work, insurance premiums, replacing lost property, offenders who have lost productivity, psychological distress, cost of legal representation, their families, the taxpayer and government, which is where our costs to the police system, costs of legal aid go in, costs of courts and corrections, and society in general. We all pay for fine, for crime, increased fear of crime, reduced business sales. So they're very complicated. It's very complicated trying to cost, and I've been to a couple of talks yesterday where people have talked about costings and different methods and acknowledged how complicated it is to cost. But that doesn't mean we don't go ahead and have a go at it. So how did we actually go about it? We did 2 sets of costs. We cost the agencies responding to crime, which we're calling our criminal justice systems cost, and we used a transactional and institutional cost analysis. I'm not going to try and explain what that is to you, but I will show you what we got. Or the costs of individual crimes, what we're calling social and economic costs. And then we're using the Australian Institute of Criminology assessment of costs by offence types. And this gentleman talked yesterday about what a huge underassessment these particular costs are. But they are the only ones that we actually have available. for offence costs in Australia, so those are the ones we're using. So we've got to remember that we probably need to increase everything we've got. These costs that the AIC include medical costs, costs of property loss or damage, cost of lost output, and intangible costs based on willingness to pay. We also heard yesterday that the willingness to pay stuff is probably a bit dodgy as well, but you know, I'm running with it. Okay, I'll just show you what we actually got out. The AIC assessed the cost of 13 offence types in 2005. They included all of those things, and I've just doubled up the slides. These were the actual estimates that they came in. We've increased them to take into account that it's not 2005, but it's 2010. Those are the offences that they costed and the basic costs associated with the offences. Not included in those offence types are about 41% of all offences are not actually included in the ones that the AIC included, particularly the illicit drug offences and public order offences, which make up about 30% of our offences are not actually costed in. So when we're starting to cost the offences, not only do we have underestimates in terms of absolute cost per offence, we also have an underestimate in terms of can't cost all the offences. So we haven't even attempted to cost these offences when we go into our costing. Our justice system costs, basically what we've done is we've broken down the system into a number of different components, and we've costed each of these different components. When we look at police costs, these are the costs that we estimated. Very crudely, what we did is we took the entire Queensland Police budget for 2009-2010, worked out how much is allocated to crime control, worked out how many offences they did, or how many of these things they did, and divided out the number into their crime control budget. And that's how we came up with these figures, very roughly. As you can see, sending a young person to court is probably the most expensive thing for police to do, and cautioning a young person is one of the cheaper things that the police do. Queensland court costs, these come from a report on government services, and they provide these costs for the courts. As you can see, our Supreme Courts are the most expensive, that's not surprisingly. Our supervision costs, well, these were even more difficult, tricky. The adult ones are easy enough because the report on government services provides adult estimates, but getting the youth detention costs and the youth community-based ones costs are very difficult. New South Wales Audit Office did a publication where they gave us some estimates which were very similar to estimates that we got out of Department of Communities as well. So we're using the New South Wales ones, but that's what we got. So those are how we got them. So when we actually put them together, this is what we've got in terms of how we cost the specific events. So if a person offends, and a young person offends and comes and it goes to court, the police costs would be the $5,000. Then they'd end up in the children's cost, and we would have added $622. And then say they got a community-based supervision order, we would have added $35 for each day that they were on an order for. And we estimated that we don't know how long they were on in incarceration, but if they were in detention, we said 70%. They served 70% of the sentence that they were given. And for adult, it was 70%. 80%, thank you very much, 80%. That's not written on my piece of paper. Okay, so the method for costing across the life course for each individual, we identified the number and the type of events over the life course. So this is your conference, your court, or your supervision. We costed each of these events by the police costs, the court costs, and the supervision, and we totaled them up. We also identified the number and the type of crimes that they committed, so of all those crimes that they committed, and we totaled those up based on those AIC costs, except of course for those 40% that we didn't have any costings for. So, and the AIC ones are underestimates, but that's how we basically did it. So we could get the cost for each individual over the lifetime. Total costs that if you then added all of those up, we got $878.5 million criminal justice system costs and $638.3 million social and economic costs, totalling $1,536 $0.5 million for this particular cohort of individuals. Okay. Across the life course, what we then did was we did the trajectory analysis, which we used Nagin-Lamb semi-parametric group-based modelling. I won't go and talk about it, but basically this is a longitudinal analysis that identifies distinct groups of offenders, and we modelled the offence frequency. So we're modelling the offences that they committed by year over time, and we identified 5 trajectories of offending. We averaged the costs of the individuals assigned to each of these across the 5 trajectories. And my next bit will be to talk about what the offending trajectories look like and how much do these trajectories cost. Okay, this is what comes out of a trajectory analysis. These are our 5 groups, and I'm going to walk through each one of them. You don't really need to sit there and interpret them, just remembering this is the age across the bottom from 10 to 25. We took up 26 because we only had half a year for them. And this is the number of offences that they committed on average across those years. So the first group, and now I'm going to have to go back to my notes because I can't remember all the numbers that I took out that I'm now going to say to you. The first group we called the adolescent peaking low offending group, and this group had an average age of onset of about 15 years. In the middle there, they had 2 offences, and most of them were property offences, and 1 event, and most of those events were cautions, right? So remembering that we can't caution past the age of 16. These group of people cost per individual $6,000 in criminal justice system costs and almost $6,000 in social and economic costs. So total we're running about $12,000. 31% of the offenders fell into this particular group, and they were responsible for only 12% of all the offences, only 9% of the justice system costs, and only 11% of social and economic. So relative to how many of them they were quite cheap. The next group we call the adult onset low offending group, and you can see this looks very similar to the adolescent onset low offending group. But the average age of onset for this group is 20, she said. I keep turning over my pieces of paper. The average age of onset is 21. In actual fact, they had a median of only 1 offence and 1 event, and most of them were an adult court offence. This group cost $9,693 in justice system costs and $5,061 in social and economic costs. So they were slightly more expensive in justice system costs, and slightly, mainly because they weren't being cautioned, because caution isn't available in Queensland for adults. And they were slightly cheaper because their offending tended to be more, she said, public order and drug offences rather than property offences. There were 53% of offenders, so the majority fell into this particular group. They were responsible for 20% of offences, 24% of justice system costs, and 17% of social and economic costs. Okay, the next group we called the adolescent onset moderate offending group. This group had an average age of onset of 15 years. They had a median of 11 offences, so we're starting to push up, and they had a median number of 7 events over their life course. The maximum that any one of these people, offences that any one of these people had was 73 offences. So that was the upper limit of this. Per individual, they cost $58,150 in justice system costs, $32,000 in social and economic costs. They made up 11% of all offenders, but they were responsible for 30% of offences, 30% of justice system costs, and 24% of social and economic costs. Again, the predominant offending in this group was drug offences and offences against the justice system. Well, they were overrepresented in drug offences, weren't the predominant. And this group also actually contained our most expensive offender. Our most expensive offender cost the system $8 million, one person, $8 million. and they had committed a number of attempted murders, that they did about 18, and at 20 they were sentenced to 14 years in jail. So that's probably why they've got quite a low trajectory, because they were actually incarcerated probably at the age of 18 in terms of remand. The next group we call our early onset chronic offending group. This group had an average age of onset of 14 years old. Their median number of offences was 35, but their maximum number, the maximum number that any one person in the system had was 426 offences. The median number was 11 events. Each of these individuals in this group was $185,000 in criminal justice system costs and $147 in social and economic costs. There are only 3% of our offenders fell into this particular group, this early onset chronic offending group, but they were responsible for 27% of all the offences, 26% of the criminal justice system costs, and 29% of the social and economic group costs. So this very small group of offenders were responsible for the large majority of the actual offending. The most frequent person in this cost the system about $1 million. They weren't as expensive because their offending wasn't very serious, so the offences didn't push out, but they did have a lot of contacts with the system. Our last group we've called the adolescent onset chronic offending group. They average age of onset was 17.5 years. Their median number of offences was 28. Their median number of events was 8. This group was, per offender, responsible for $141,000 of criminal justice system costs, $161,000 of social and economic. So these were more expensive because their offending was actually more serious. This was 2% of all the offenders, so we're down to very small numbers, responsible 11% of offences, 12% of justice system costs, and 19% of the social and economic costs. So, one thing we hadn't talked about is custodial outcomes. One of the biggest expenses in the system is actually, imprisonment or detention. So looking at across the groups about ever detained, what we find is that of the early onset chronic offending group, 15% of them were detained in detention, so prior to the age of 17 years old. And ever imprisoned, what we actually see of the adolescent onset chronic offending group, over half of them went to prison, thus pushing up their costs of the criminal justice system. And over a third of the early onset chronic offending group also ended up in prison. This, and I've just popped back to the actual offending trajectories. Interesting enough, these are the two chronic groups, and although we haven't looked at it, it's wondering if these high rates of incarceration are actually why we have such substantial drops in the trajectories as these people get older. Something we can look at, but we actually haven't managed to look at. I mean, that will depend very much on what the length of the sentences are. I never really want to find information that shows that incapacitation actually has a crime reduction effect. However, some research that's been done by Boxar does actually support that argument. So I'd be interested to have a look at that in our data. So just in summary, what we actually have is that 84% of our offenders actually fall into a low offending group, 11% into our moderate offending group, and 5% fall into one of our two chronic offending groups. And in terms of the costs, that 5% that fall into our two chronic offending costs in total to the system 42% of the cost. So what we can see quite clearly, I think everybody can see, if we could stop this lot offending, we're going to save a lot of money. I think that's my basic argument. That's what I've stood up here to say. I can go now. So what are the implications of these findings? First of all, not all offenders are the same. We have a very heterogeneous nature of offending, and a small number of offenders are responsible for much of offending, and a small number of offenders are responsible for much of the costs. So it would be cost effective to target the 5% of offenders in the chronic offending trajectories to reduce the cost of offending and to reduce the costs of victimisation. That's my overall take-home message, but specifically, many offenders only appear once and do not reappear, so the cost-effective options Cost-effective options effective. That was good, wasn't it? I don't know where I got that one. Police cautioning, and we can see that in the youth justice system and in terms of costs for the adolescents. But in the adult system in Queensland, we don't have cautioning available for diverting people. It may be a cost-effective thing to actually provide cautioning options for police for adults. For the chronic offending trajectories, the 5% that we would really like to get out of the system, we need to use evidence-based programs to actually address those. Early intervention programs such as parenting programs, structured preschool programs, family support programs. These are all put together in Ross Hummel's Pathway to Prevention program, which is actually running up in Queensland. We also need evidence-based therapeutic interventions, and these are the interventions I was talking about earlier. Small numbers of individuals in these programs, very expensive, but in the long term are going to be cheap, and things that have got the evidence base are like multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy, multi-dimensional treatment, foster care, and the cognitive behaviour interventions. There is increasing interest in using costs and evidence-based policy making. So those are the what I think it all means. For me, what does it mean? There's more research to be done. One of the biggest questions, of course, is can we predict? If we want to target, we need to be able to predict. And, you know, Steve was talking about this yesterday. It's about the risk assessments. We have risk assessment tools. I'm very interested in building risk assessment tools. I think these data can actually help us to look at how we could predict which particular trajectory people are going to end up on. And we need to do that work. We haven't done that work yet. One of the things that you probably haven't noticed, but there are the three early onset offending groups tend to separate out at the ages of 14 and 15. So the question is, why does someone go onto a chronic offending trajectory rather than just desist and move out of the system? And also I want to know what the impact of incapacitation is on these trajectory analysis. Really, are there differences in the offending trajectories for Indigenous and non-Indigenous? We've just done a straight analysis. We could actually separate these analyses out, see whether or not we're getting different patterns for these two groups. What you can see is these are very valuable data sets. They provide us with an understanding of the life course of offending, understand individuals' contact across agencies, and we are currently, I've just got another ARC grant, and we're currently linking in mental health data from Queensland and also the trauma data from Queensland. So that will give us even more information, A, about their costs to the system, because I imagine they'll be proportionately high, and also the links between mental health and offending, which is something that I'm very interested in. Final thoughts, absolutely final thoughts, and I'm linking this back to what I heard yesterday, great conference, really interesting papers. Steve was talking about the focus on high-risk offenders. I think I'm reiterating this. It's the 5%. We need to be able to identify these 5% and put evidence-based interventions in to support these 5%. We need to ensure, and all the research shows, he talked about treatment fidelity. We need to make sure that people are doing these programs according to the way these programs have been designed, because that's where the evidence-based lies. If we're going to punish, we need to focus on certainty and swiftness, not severity. And the thing that I really liked about what Steve was talking about was this concept that we have a portfolio of evidence-based responses, and that we need all of the responses. We need to look at cautioning for adults. We need to look at the expensive intervention programs, and we need to target them to specific offenders. I also went to a really interesting talk yesterday by two local government people who were really talking about the difficulty in accessing evidence and the difficulty in creating evidence. And I thought it was a very thoughtful talk. And they talked about the fact that we need evidence that's accessible. Many evaluations are actually done in-house and aren't made publicly accessible, so that people like even myself cannot get hold of them. I think we need to increase our evidence base, and we need to increase the transparency of what's been done. We need to look at what doesn't work as well as what does work, and we need collaborative partnerships between academics and service providers and government in order to do good evaluations. We also need to build the skills and capacity, and that's it's a difficult thing to talk about, because in actual fact evaluation science is a difficult and growing science, and people are out there arguing all the time about randomised controlled trials and different methods for actually doing evaluation. But we do need to try and get that from an academic into the practitioners so people do actually understand how to do good evaluations. And one way that you can do that is buy my book, which came out last week, and we're very proud of, Evidence-Based Policy and Practice in Youth Justice. It's an edited book, so there are a number of chapters by all the people that we know. And I want to thank you, and also thank the team of people involved in this project: Troy, April, Carleen, Susan and Christine, Department of Communities, OESR and Legal Aid Queensland. Thank you very much.